Have you ever wondered if someone the whole world sees as insignificant was actually holding a secret powerful enough to bring down an empire? Would you believe it? Picture this: an elderly black woman standing before a crowd that mocks her, gripping an old rusty gun everyone assumes is useless. One shot rings out, and every eye freezes, the room falling into absolute silence. Would you dare step into a world where the ones deemed weak are, in fact, the most dangerous of all? Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the stories that shatter stereotypes, the shocking truths you'd never expect. And don't forget to drop a comment below. What would you do if the whole room turned against you, but you knew you were holding the truth? Sophie Brennan, a retired black special operative who was once the legend of the Shadow Echo unit, now lives in seclusion. Yet today she steps into the cutting-edge Hawthorne Precision Dome, not to show off her skills, but to defend her own honor. The old worn rifle in her hands trembles slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of a past too heavy to forget. The crowd jeers, cold laughter slicing through the air like a blade. But the instant Sophie squeezes the trigger, the entire room collapses into a deadly silence. One bullet, one perfect shot, and the most arrogant among them crumble in stunned disbelief. From the shadows, Elias Griffin, her former comrade, appears, breathless. "Sophie, they're wiping us out. Obsidian Tactical has begun." Sophie grips an old letter tightly, the one she swore she'd never open. But now, the moment has come. At the edge of the room, Celeste Monroe, the niece Sophie has always loved as family, stands frozen. She never knew that her quiet, humble aunt was the legendary ghost who had saved countless lives. Celeste's eyes glisten. "Auntie, why am I only learning this now?" Outside, a black SUV circles the hilltop, silent yet menacing, a sign that the storm has truly arrived. In that brief moment, Sophie turns away slightly, her eyes heavy with regret. Can I still save anyone when I've already lost everything? If you're listening, remember, hit that subscribe button now and drop a comment below. What would you do if the whole world turned its back, but you were the only one left holding the truth? Beside Sophie Brennan, the legendary black ex-operative of Shadow Echo, stands Celeste Monroe. Young, sharp, always admiring her aunt, yet never fully understanding the heroic past buried beneath that quiet gardener's life. Now Celeste gazes at Sophie with a mix of confusion and awe. The humble woman she thought only knew how to tend roses, standing at the heart of a deadly conspiracy. In Sophie's hand is an old letter, its edges worn thin, holding a promise she's never revealed. Celeste's voice trembles as she asks, "Auntie, since when?" But Sophie only offers a faint, sorrowful smile, her frail hand resting gently on Celeste's shoulder. A painful beat of silence passes. "Are you ready?" Sophie asks softly, and the answer doesn't come through words. It's in Celeste's determined eyes, in the fists she clenches tight. Outside, the roar of black SUVs rumbles up the Stonecrest Hollow slope, a warning that Obsidian Tactical has found them. Elias Griffin, Sophie's old comrade, bursts in. "They're just minutes away. Sophie, your niece has to go." But Sophie shakes her head, her gaze calm, filled with quiet sacrifice. "If someone has to stay today, it's me." Celeste chokes back a sob. "No, I'm not leaving you." But Sophie has already pressed a data drive into her hand, whispering, "Take this truth out, Celeste." For all of us. As Sophie Brennan stepped into the Hawthorne Precision Dome, she held Celeste Monroe's hand tightly, fully aware they were walking straight into the enemy's den. Declan Hart, the powerful CEO of Obsidian Tactical Systems, couldn't hide his smug, cutting smile. Before a jeering crowd, he handed Sophie an old battered sniper rifle, rigged with subtle sabotage, all to turn her into a public humiliation. Celeste swallowed back tears, her eyes darting desperately around the room, searching for anyone who might help. But everywhere, there were only enemies. In the back stood Elias Griffin, Sophie's former comrade, his eyes blurring with emotion as he watched her lift the rigged weapon, her hands trembling yet resolute. A bead of sweat traced down Sophie's forehead as she gripped the rifle tighter, desperately working to undo the trap set against her. In that moment, Celeste understood. The aunt she'd always assumed was just a faded shadow in the family was, in truth, carrying the weight of everything. The truth, their honor, and their very lives. "Don't do this, Auntie," Celeste choked out, her voice breaking. But Sophie only gave a faint, bittersweet smile, shaking her head gently. "Some battles, my dear, can't be avoided." Just then, the click echoed, the gun jammed, and Declan burst into cruel laughter. But before the shame could strike, Ilias lunged forward, knocking Sophie aside, sacrificing himself so she could escape the trap. The room exploded into chaos, screams tearing through the air. Sophie Brennan calmly lifted the sabotaged rifle, the hands that once trembled now steady as steel. One bullet, a single shot. The room, which moments ago roared with mocking laughter, fell silent as if the air had been sucked out. The bullet struck dead center on the farthest target, with such precision that Declan Hart, the mastermind behind this cruel setup, was forced to swallow his smirk. Beside her, Celeste Monroe, her young niece, stood wide-eyed, her heart tightening. This wasn't just a shot. It was the moment that ripped away the mask her aunt had worn for years. But even in that instant of triumph, tragedy crept in. Elias Griffin, Sophie's old comrade, quietly intercepted a second sniper Sophie hadn't seen. As Sophie lifted her gaze and met Elias's eyes, realization struck. He had thrown himself into the line of fire for her and taken the bullet. Celeste screamed, racing forward, while Sophie, her legs turned to stone. "Auntie, what do we do now?" Celeste choked out, her small hand clinging desperately to Sophie. Gently, Sophie squeezed her niece's shoulder, her voice a soft whisper. "We stand, my love. We stand tall." The past rushed in like a biting wind as Elias Griffin, the former Shadow Echo comrade, stepped out from the shadows, his face etched with the years spent on the run. "Sophie, they don't just want to take you down. They want to erase all of us," he said, his voice rough with restraint. Sophie Brennan staggered for a split second, her hand gripping the shoulder of Celeste Monroe, her young niece who had just witnessed a legend rise before her very eyes. Elias laid an old weathered letter on the table, along with a map of an ancient archive Declan Hart had been secretly hunting for years. Sophie's heart clenched tight. This wasn't just a battle for honor. It was a fight to protect the memory of an entire generation. But then, gunfire cracked outside the door. A black SUV screeched into view and Elias rushed to block the path, shouting, "Run, Sophie! Take all of this!" The moment Elias fell, Sophie nearly collapsed, her knees buckling. Celeste clung to her aunt's arm, tears streaming down her face. "Auntie, what do we do now?" she sobbed. Sophie lifted her head, her eyes wet but her voice like steel. "We don't run anymore. It's time we become the storm, my love." Under the heavy gray sky of Blackthorn Hollow, Sophie Brennan and Celeste Monroe tore through the blackened trees, dead leaves crunching beneath their feet. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, not just from the chase, the black SUVs thundering behind them, but because they were carrying a secret powerful enough to rewrite history. Beside them, Elias Griffin, his back soaked in blood, still pushed forward, casting Sophie a look filled with silent meaning. "Save them. Don't save me." A breathless heartbeat. The roar of engines sharpened. A gunshot cracked through the air. Elias collapsed to his knees, hurling the USB drive into Sophie's trembling hands, just before vanishing into the shadows of the dense forest. Sophie clutched it tightly, her heart fracturing with every beat. Celeste's voice broke in a sob. "Auntie, why did it have to be Elias? What do we do now?" Swallowing her grief, Sophie gritted her teeth. "We run, but not to hide. We run to end this." They darted through thorns, the small paw prints of Rocco, their loyal dog, pressing into the wet mud beside them. Every pounding step was a reminder of memories of silent sacrifices and of the promise Sophie had once whispered in her old comrade's ear. "If I survive, I will tell everything." In the cold, echoing darkness of Ravencrest Caverns, Sophie Brennan and Elias Griffin moved carefully between the moss-covered stone walls, their breaths sounding like whispers from the past. A trembling flashlight beam swept across a cracked slab. The hidden spot where documents, missing for decades, lay waiting. If we find it, Elias murmured, his voice rough and fading from blood loss, the world will finally know the truth. But in his eyes flickered a quiet pain. He knew he didn't have much time left. Sophie tightened her grip on his hand, desperate to hold on to something, anything. But Elias shook his head gently. Go on, Sophie. This is your last shot. In that fleeting moment, under the dim glow, Celeste Monroe, Sophie's niece, appeared just behind them, her face streaked with tears. She had never witnessed a farewell this heartbreaking. Outside Ravencrest Caverns, with the last streaks of sunset barely clinging to the sky, Mason Whitaker, the infamous mercenary commander, clenched the radio in his fist, his eyes locked on the thermal map before him. 3 red signals blinked steadily, Sophie, Celeste, and Elias, moving slowly through the treacherous terrain. Declan's orders are clear, he growled into the mic. No one leaves this zone. No one lives. Meanwhile, inside, Celeste was nearly out of strength. Her heels were raw and bleeding, but she forced herself to keep pace behind Elias, who just minutes earlier had been hastily bandaged by Sophie. In the distance, the low growl of engines drifted up from Blackthorn Hollow. They knew time was no longer counted in hours, but in minutes. Sophie Brennan said nothing. She rested her hand on the last remaining gun, then extended it toward Elias. But he shook his head firmly. Sophie, you know the truth. If someone has to stay behind today, it can't be you. A long silence stretched between them. Sophie turned to Celeste, her gaze softening, like a mother looking at her daughter one last time, before sending her away. When Sophie, Celeste, and Elias first met Talia Cross, she was just an independent journalist in the town of Ashgrove Heights. Stubborn, relentless, always digging for the truth even when faced with threats. But today, as Talia stepped out from the quiet cafe, handing Sophie a thick dossier, there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. If I give this to you, I'll lose everything. But if I don't, we'll lose this entire country. In that instant, Sophie understood. No one in their group was an outsider anymore. They were bound by an invisible thread, the truth. What would you do if the truth you held could save millions, but would destroy the lives of everyone standing beside you? Far off, the wail of police sirens pierced the air. Talia trembled, her hand brushing Sophie's collar. Don't let them take it, she whispered, eyes glistening, before pushing Sophie through the back door and stepping forward herself, willingly offering up her arrest to buy them time. Celeste turned back, screaming, "We can't leave her!" But Elias gripped her shoulder tightly, his voice rough and choked. If we go back, we lose everything. On the table, a small piece of paper fluttered down. Talia's messy handwriting scratched across it. Don't forget why we started. Sophie clenched the note in her fist, her heart tightening painfully. She knew there was no turning back. And sometimes the price of guarding the truth is watching others sacrifice themselves for you. Under the dim yellow lights of Cedar Fall Junction, once just a quiet little town, the pounding on the door echoed like a war drum. Sophie stood at the center of the old meeting hall, staring out at the crowd. Mechanics, farmers, teachers, grandmothers, fathers, mothers, all wearing the same fierce look in their eyes. We will not bow. Have you ever witnessed the moment when ordinary people decide to do something extraordinary, even knowing it might cost them everything? Elias, struggling to stand despite the blood-soaked bandages on his leg, whispered, Sophie, they believe in you. Celeste, trembling yet determined, clutched her aunt's hand, her eyes blazing with a fragile mix of hope and fear. Outside, Declan Hart's voice roared through the loudspeakers. Hand over the data, or this town disappears from the map. An old blacksmith stepped forward, resting a heavy hand on Sophie's shoulder. You are not alone. A young mother, cradling her baby, tightened her grip on the axe in her hand and murmured, We have no way back. Sophie took a deep breath, the weight of helplessness crashing in her chest like a tidal wave. If they resisted, how many here would fall? But if they did nothing, the truth would be buried forever. What would you do when an entire community looks to you, believes in you, places their last hopes in your hands? but you know sacrifice is inevitable. A distant explosion shattered the night, red lights searing across the sky. Sophie clenched her fists, her heart heavy as stone. Tonight, Cedar Fall Junction would not stand down. But the price they were about to pay, would it be too high? Inside Foxglove Assembly Hall, urgent whispers filled the air. Maps were spread across the table. Faded photographs lay scattered, and scribbled pencil notes crossed each page. Sophie stood silently, her eyes moving across every face around her. Elias gripping her shoulder, Celeste clutching the trembling laptop beside her, and Rocco, their loyal dog, lying still, ears perked, every muscle alert. Have you ever found yourself at the center of a plan with no way out? Where a single wrong step could shatter not just your honor, but everyone's lives? Declan Hart had blocked every escape route, but Sophie knew. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting so the world can know the truth. Outside, pounding fists shook the door. A team member collapsed, pale and gasping, barely able to whisper, "They've found us." The air tightened, Celeste's hand gripping Sophie's wrist, her tear-filled eyes pleading, "We could lose everything. Do you understand, Auntie?" Sophie looked around. Every face, every breath, every flicker of fear and resolve. Helplessness surged in her chest like a rising tide. But then a faint, dry chuckle broke through. Elias, once broken and battered, now standing on crutches smirking. "If not us, then who? What would you choose, to run and save yourself, or stand and face it, knowing the cost might be everything?" Sophie drew a deep, aching breath. Her chest tightened with a familiar, painful weight. She nodded, signaling to everyone, "Let's go. We can't let them snuff out this light." Outside, the night remained dark, but inside Foxglove Assembly Hall, a small flame had just been lit, fueled by trust, by hope, and by hearts ready to sacrifice. At the base of Maple Ridge Bluff, the icy fog shimmered under the cutting beams of black SUV headlights, slicing through the night. Sophie tightened her grip on Celeste's shoulder, her eyes locked on the silent figures advancing. The predators had arrived, and this confrontation offered no way back. Have you ever felt yourself standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing one more step could send you over, but still, you're forced to move forward? Elias, standing beside Sophie, rasped, "We can't let them steal the truth." Inside, Celeste trembled, yet her small hand clung tightly to Sophie's, tears welling in her eyes. "Auntie, if this doesn't work," she whispered. Sophie turned, lowering her forehead gently to Celeste's, whispering back, "We chose this path. I won't abandon anyone again." Suddenly, a sharp explosion ripped through the hillside. A team member went down, eyes wide, unable to speak a word. In that frozen instant, the whole world seemed to stop. Sophie could hear her own heartbeat pounding, not from fear, but from the surge of helplessness crashing inside her. What would you do when loss unfolds right before your eyes, when a flicker of hope is almost snuffed out the moment it's lit? Sophie clenched her trembling hand into a fist, took a deep breath, and growled through gritted teeth, "Go! We keep moving, for the one who just fell, for everyone who ever believed in us." At the foot of Maple Ridge Bluff, the darkness still pressed in, thick and merciless. But inside, in every person, every heartbeat, every tear, one unbreakable vow had been forged. We do not bow. Silas Granger stood frozen in the middle of Willowshade Crossing, the crackling voice of Declan Hart hissing through the radio at his ear. "End this, Silas, or you'll be the one who's ended." His hand trembled, the weight of the gun heavy, pulling him down. Before him stood Sophie and her group, once just names in a file, now flesh and blood, shaking, bloodied, but still standing, waiting for him to choose. If you stood on the razor's edge between justice and power, which would you choose? Celeste looked up at Silas, her wide, tear-filled eyes trembling as she whispered, "Uncle, are you really going to let them kill me and Auntie?" Beside her, Elias gripped Sophie's hand tightly, his eyes a weary mix of exhaustion and fragile hope. And Sophie, that old but unbreakable woman, gazed at Silas with no begging, no blame, just a steady, piercing look. Do what you know is right. In that fleeting instant, Silas remembered the night his father died. A cop who'd once stood at the same crossroads and bowed his head. That pain had never left him. What would you do if you knew that a single choice could either bury or save your soul? Silas drew a shaky breath, lowered his gun, and whispered, "No, not again." He turned, facing the advancing mercenary team, raising his hand to signal a ceasefire, his heart pounding in his chest. "If you want to get to them, you'll have to go through me." A chilling silence spread across the field. Then, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps pressing forward. One choice, one sacrifice, and an entire life shifting in the space of a heartbeat. Inside the small room at Foxglove Assembly Hall, Rowan Bennett, a young tech engineer, sat before a screen flooded with chaotic lines of code, sweat beading on his forehead. Behind him, Sophie stood, clutching the old letter in her hand, her heart pounding. Celeste paced anxiously back and forth, while Elias placed a steady hand on Rowan's shoulder, whispering, "We've only got one shot. Have you ever held evidence that could change the entire world, yet feared that one wrong move might destroy it all?" Rowan drew a shaky breath, murmuring, "The final security code, but if I get it wrong, the entire drive will wipe itself." Outside, the roar of engines echoed. Mason Whitaker and Declan's mercenary team were right at the door. Sophie laid a hand on Rowan's shoulder, her voice low and firm. "It's not just data, Rowan. It's the souls of everyone who's already fallen." A loud crash rattled the walls. Celeste gasped, panicked. "They're breaking down the door." Elias drew his gun, ready, but his eyes softened as they fell on Celeste. He knew full well, in this moment, hope didn't lie in the barrel of a weapon. It lay in the trembling hands of Rowan. What would you do if you knew one small decision could save millions, or crush the last spark of hope? Rowan pressed the key. The screen flickered. 1 second of agonizing silence. Then suddenly the files appeared, earth-shattering evidence lighting up the monitor, exposing the darkest truths. Sophie exhaled a shaky whisper. "We did it." But just then, the main door crashed inward, and a deafening explosion tore through the room. In the midst of chaos, as gunfire echoed above, it was Rocco, the German shepherd Sophie had once rescued from a brutal training camp, who suddenly barked fiercely, darting toward a moss-covered stone wall. Celeste froze. "What is it, Rocco?" Sophie stepped closer, her trembling hand brushing the stone. And then, it shifted. A narrow passage opened, whispering stoneway, the secret tunnel that had only ever existed in old stories. Would you dare put your faith in an animal, in raw instinct, when every other door had slammed shut? They crept through the dark tunnel, Rocco leading the way, eyes sharp, his scarred, shadowed fur a living testament to past battles. But then, a shuddering explosion rattled behind them. Elias spun around. "They found us!" Sophie shoved Celeste forward, her voice choked. "Run, baby! Hold on to the evidence!" In the darkness, when every escape seems to collapse, who will be the one willing to stay behind so the others can keep moving forward? Celeste turned back, tears streaming down her face, but Rocco let out a low growl, gently tugging her sleeve, pulling her onward. The group sprinted toward the faint, flickering light at the end of the tunnel, where a fragile thread of hope still waited. And in that brief heartbeat, Sophie watched them go, whispering to herself, "I promised I'd protect them, no matter the cost." At Iron Vale Outpost, the air was thick with tension. Sophie walked slowly down the crumbling hallway, each footstep echoing like a ghostly reminder from the past. Ahead, Declan Hart stood waiting, a cold smile curling on his lips, his hand wrapped tightly around his gun. Have you ever looked straight into the eyes of the one who betrayed and shattered your life, and wondered if forgiveness was ever even an option? Sophie drew in a long breath, remembering her promise to Celeste, to Elias, to herself. No one gets left behind. But when Elias suddenly lunged forward, taking a bullet meant for her from one of Declan's men, everything tilted. Sophie let out a broken cry, catching Elias as he collapsed, his blood staining her hands. His eyes flickered with a faint, fading smile. Go. You have to finish this. Sometimes the greatest sacrifice isn't in leaving, but in accepting that someone else must keep going. Sophie rose slowly, her gaze burning with fire. Declan, it's time you paid the price. Her voice rang out like a bell cutting through the darkness. They grappled. Gun against gun, belief against betrayal, tangled in memories that could never be mended. In the final moment, when Sophie wrenched the evidence from Declan's grip, she didn't pull the trigger. She simply stared straight into his eyes, her voice a quiet blade. You're the one who has to live with this guilt. Forever. In the darkness of Ironvale Outpost, Celeste stumbled upon an old letter, its edges torn and frayed, the ink faded by time. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, realizing it was a letter Sophie had once written to her father. A promise from long ago. I will protect what you believed in, even if it costs me everything. Have you ever held a fragment of the past only to realize it's heavier than any weapon you could carry? Clutching the letter tightly, tears streamed down Celeste's face. She understood now. This fight wasn't just about evidence, wasn't just about taking down Declan. It was about keeping a promise, about defending memories long buried, but never truly gone. Outside, the gunfire roared on, Sophie and Elias still holding the line against the enemy. In that moment of helplessness, Celeste rose, sprinting toward the front, holding the tattered letter high like a small, fragile flag. We're not just fighting for today, she cried out, her voice breaking. We're fighting for everyone who fell for the truth. Sometimes true strength doesn't come from weapons, but from a scrap of paper and a heart that refuses to bow. Sophie turned, her eyes locking onto Celeste's figure, and for the briefest moment, they softened. That was the instant she knew. The next generation was ready to rise, and the past had finally found someone to carry its flame. Talia Cross stood atop the roof of Ironvale Outpost, the camera trembling in her hands, her breath ragged and sharp. Below, gunfire rattled the ground, flashes from small explosions ripping through the night's darkness. She aimed the lens, her heart pounding wildly, whispering under her breath, This is the moment the world has to see. Have you ever thought that one small press of a button could bring down an entire empire? Down in the courtyard, Sophie and Declan wrestled, sweat, blood, and conviction blurring together. Elias shouted up, Talia, broadcast it! Now! A bullet grazed her shoulder, but Talia didn't flinch. She slammed the button, launching the live signal. Across millions of screens, the world watched. Sophie raising the old letter high, Celeste clutching Rocco tightly, the people of Cedar Falls standing behind them with fists raised, every frame capturing the unshakable power of truth. In that instant, no one was a stranger. Talia whispered softly, If I don't make it, at least the truth has been told. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not from fear, but because she knew. Her sacrifice had unlocked a door of hope for them all. And you? What would you do if you knew that one act, just one, could change the world forever? Obsidian Tactical had fallen. The ones who once held all the power were now nothing more than fading names on the evening news. But as Sophie Brennan stood alone in the dimly lit room, her trembling fingers brushing over the old letter, she knew the real battle had never just been out there. Have you ever wondered how to mend a heart covered in scars? Celeste quietly stepped in, gently placing a hand on her aunt's shoulder, saying nothing. Outside the window, Elias sat by the fire with Rocco, his gaze distant, lost in the horizon. A part of Sophie wanted to run out, throw her arms around them, scream, We did it! We won! But another part whispered softly, What did we lose to get here? Her fingers traced the faded words on the page. Father, I'm still here. Tears fell, not from failure, but because at last she understood. The greatest victory wasn't toppling an enemy, it was learning to forgive herself. What would you do if you realized the thing holding you captive the longest was the ghost inside your own heart? As dawn broke over Willowshade Crest, golden light washed across the hills. Sophie squeezed Celeste's hand, stepping outside, letting the wind carry away the last of her fear. And in that moment, The audience was left with one haunting question. Do those who win in the shadows ever find their names remembered in the light? At the peak of Willowshade Crest, the dawn light washed over their quiet faces. Sophie rested a hand on Celeste's shoulder, with Elias standing beside them, his body weary, and Rocco, the loyal German shepherd, lying at their feet, eyes lifted toward the sky. Have you ever wondered, are there victories meant to be carried only in the heart, never written into history books? There were no cheers, no applause. They simply stood there, breathing in the air of a world that had just been changed, but a change whose true worth only they would ever understand. Sophie clenched the old letter tightly, a single tear sliding down her cheek, not from sorrow but from release. Celeste, her voice trembling, whispered, Auntie, we really did it, didn't we? Elias only gave a quiet nod, his eyes reflecting a mix of relief and quiet grief, because what they had won today had been bought with silent sacrifices no one but them would ever know. What would you do if your entire life left behind a story no one would write down? Would you still have the courage to keep walking forward? If this story touches your heart, leave a comment below. What do you feel most? Hope, pain, or connection? And don't forget to subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that go unnamed, unwritten, the ones only your heart will remember. There are stories that never need to make the headlines, never need to air on television, yet they echo forever in the hearts of those who witness them. The story of Sophie Brennan, Celeste Monroe, Elias Griffin, and the loyal dog Rocco is one of those. They didn't just fight to expose a conspiracy, they fought to preserve something the world so easily forgets today, truth and loyalty. And through that journey, Sophie came to understand something profound. Not every battle is measured by victories on the front line. Some fights exist solely to protect what you believe is right, even if no one else sees it, even if no one else offers thanks. Celeste learned that the people we love are never just ordinary characters in our lives. They carry within them depths, sacrifices, and silent battles we may never truly grasp unless we walk beside them through the storms. Elias, a man once broken by his past, rediscovered meaning not through glory or recognition, but through the simple, raw connection between human beings. A clasped hand, a quiet look, a silent presence that says, I'm with you. The greatest lesson from this story? Sometimes it's the victories no one sees, the truths no one cheers for, that shape who we are. Live in a way that, even if no one's watching, you know you dared to love, dared to fight, and dared to choose what's right. Sparkle,